In the frozen twilight of the Barents Sea, December 1944, a British convoy, codenamed PQ-93, vanished without trace between the Shetland Islands and Murmansk. Official reports would later blame violent storms and U-boat packs. But the truth, buried beneath layers of naval censorship and Cold War paranoia, suggests something far stranger. Among the lost ships was HMS Blythemore, a converted escort vessel carrying classified cargo under the codename Operation Harrowgate. No survivors, no wreckage, only a faint distress signal intercepted once, recorded at 2300 hours, repeating the words, "Cobalt secured, engines failing." 70 years later, fragments of the truth are surfacing. One decrypted message, one missing officer, one secret shipment that should never have existed. Chapter 1. Operation Harrowgate, the Vanished Convoy. On December 11, 1944, Convoy PQ-93 departed from Loch Ewe, Scotland, under low visibility and freezing sleet. It consisted of 11 merchant ships and 4 Royal Navy escorts, bound for the Soviet port of Murmansk with ammunition, radar components, and what was vaguely described in naval manifests as special scientific apparatus. The convoy's flagship, HMS Blythemore, commanded by Captain Leonard Fairchild, maintained radio silence except for brief coded exchanges with the Admiralty's North Atlantic Command and Scapa Flow. These transmissions were heavily encrypted under the cipher Black Key, reserved for missions of national security. The sea that winter was cruel. Ice formed on decks faster than crews could chip it away. On December 14th, a weather front from the Arctic Circle swept across the Barents, severing contact between the convoy's western and eastern elements. 2 freighters broke formation. By the next morning, radar sweeps showed nothing but static. The convoy had entered what naval officers would later refer to as Grid Square 51 Delta, an area notorious for magnetic interference. HMS Blythemore's final confirmed position was logged at 73 degrees 15 to N, 18 to 42 E. Within 2 hours, every ship vanished from Allied tracking. In January 1945, British Naval Command issued an official communiqué. PQ-93 presumed lost to enemy action. But an internal MI6 memorandum dated January 22nd, marked Eyes Only, Harrowgate, paints a different picture. It references unauthorized transmissions, detected on an unregistered frequency between Blythemore and an unknown German vessel. The signal, recorded by a listening station in Reykjavik, contained fragments of a conversation in broken English and German. One phrase stood out, "Delivery confirmed, coordinates sealed." The note was signed by Major Robert Kells of the Naval Intelligence Division, who would later disappear from his post without explanation in March. 1946 archival interviews from 1979, with surviving crewmen from other Arctic convoys, recall rumours that Blythemore had been carrying something far more significant than munitions. One witness, Petty Officer Harold Smythe, claimed that scientific cargo often referred to captured technology or materials exchanged between Allied research divisions. "We were told it was radar equipment," he said in a declassified oral history. But the guards, they weren't Navy. They wore plain coats, never spoke, and carried sidearms. That wasn't standard procedure for cargo runs. Meanwhile, Soviet records from the Murmansk archives, unsealed in 1993, mention a British vessel transmitting coded beacon from Sector 12F on December 16th, 2 days after the convoy's disappearance. The Soviet icebreaker, Sibirskaya Zvezda, reported heavy interference on sonar and electromagnetic anomalies, consistent with disrupted field resonance. The report was dismissed at the time, buried in administrative correspondence under meteorological distortion. In 1952, a small research team from the British Hydrographic Office conducted a quiet expedition in the Barents. Their classified report, titled Operation Winterglass, never appeared in public archives. However, a page recovered through a Freedom of Information request includes a handwritten note. Sample retrieved. Contamination risk high. Store under cobalt protocol. The term cobalt appears repeatedly in post-war documents connected to experimental ordnance and radiological devices, but its precise meaning remains unclear. Analysts believe Project Cobalt may have referred to early British attempts to study nuclear isotope containment during the war, an effort predating the Manhattan Project success. What complicates the record further is the discovery of undeveloped film reels in 1976 from the Royal Navy's Photointelligence Division. These reels, labelled BLY-12, depict a vessel matching the Blythemoor's silhouette, surrounded by fog and ice floes, its deck stacked with lead-lined containers. A blurred figure in a long coat appears near the bridge, saluting toward a passing aircraft. The footage ends abruptly, as if the camera had been dropped. No such film was ever declared in official war documentation. Cross-analysis of Admiralty logs, declassified MI6 papers, and Soviet naval archives paints a chilling pattern. Every mention of PQ-93 ends with a censorship note or missing record. The logbook of Commander Ellis Munro, stationed at Scapa Flow, includes one cryptic entry on December 20th, 1944. Harrowgate concluded. Subject transferred beyond Northern Sector. File sealed. That log entry was later struck through in red pencil, followed by the initials KD, Admiralty Review. To this day, no wreckage of PQ-93 has been definitively located. Multiple sonar sweeps in 1978, 1989, and 2012 reported metallic anomalies within the convoy's last recorded coordinates, but subsequent dives found nothing. Divers describe compass malfunction, sudden power loss, and interference consistent with strong magnetic or radiological fields. Some speculate the cargo aboard Blythemoor was not intended for Murmansk at all, but for a mid-sea transfer, a secret exchange with a German U-boat under wartime truce conditions. The notion seems impossible, yet both Allied and Axis intelligence records mention clandestine communications in December 1944 regarding mutual research interests. The last documented transmission attributed to the convoy, recorded at 2300 hours on December 15th, was partially decrypted decades later. The voice, believed to be Captain Fairchild, utters a calm but strained message. Cobalt secured. Engines failing. Orders unclear. May God forgive us. Immediately after static. No rescue attempt was launched. The official record declared the message inauthentic. In 1999, a team of Norwegian deep-sea engineers detected faint radiation spikes along the Arctic seabed northwest of Tromsø. The readings matched the isotope profile associated with cobalt-60 decay. When their findings were submitted to NATO environmental authorities, the report was quietly retracted within weeks. All subsequent expeditions to that sector were denied under the pretext of ecological protection zones. Scholars now believe Operation Harrowgate was part of a covert, Allied experiment, an effort to test or conceal radiological weaponry under the guise of Arctic supply missions. Others insist it was an intelligence handoff gone wrong, involving captured German materials related to advanced propulsion or isotope research. The truth remains buried beneath 70 years of denial. A final note, unearthed in 2016 from a private collection belonging to Rear Admiral H.P. Lonsdale, may hold the last fragment of evidence. Scrawled on the back of a telegram marked "Urgent, Admiralty Eyes Only" is a single line. Blythemoor completed transfer. Grid 51 Delta. Do not pursue. Cobalt remains contained. No one knows who wrote it or to whom it was addressed. The handwriting does not match any known officer from the convoy. If the records are accurate, then the disappearance of PQ-93 was no mere tragedy of war. It was a deliberate act of erasure, a mission scrubbed from history to conceal an operation so dangerous, so politically volatile, that even victory could not justify its existence. The Barents Sea keeps its silence, but the static echoes remain on archived recordings, faint, distorted, and endlessly repeating that final phrase. Cobalt secured. Chapter 2. The Ghost Bunker Beneath Peenemünde. In May 1945, as the Red Army stormed across northern Germany, the Allied command believed the Peenemünde Army Research Center, once the birthplace of the V-2 rocket, had been completely destroyed by earlier bombings. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed a landscape of cratered concrete and twisted steel. Yet beneath that surface, concealed by wreckage and rubble, was a sealed sublevel known only to a handful of engineers in the Versuchsanstalt, the Experimental Institute. The existence of this lower facility was denied by both German and Allied reports until 1948, when Soviet aerial photographs revealed faint structural outlines inconsistent with any documented plans of the site. Soviet engineers referred to it as Unterbau Sector 13 now, or Substructure Sector 13. According to a declassified 1956 KGB memorandum, the bunker was accessed through an elevator shaft hidden under a collapsed V2 assembly hall. The document, written by Colonel Ivan M. Volkov, details a brief but intense exchange between Soviet reconnaissance units and armed German technicians who refused to surrender the site. Volkov's men reported unusual light emission from sub-level corridor and mechanical hum inconsistent with conventional power sources. A follow-up order, labeled Directive 4107P, instructed all findings to be secured for transfer to Special Research Bureau, Moscow. British intelligence learned of the same discovery through intercepted Soviet radio transmissions. A May 1948 MI6 summary titled Project Emberlight notes Soviet exploitation of residual Peenemünde structures possibly linked to energy experimentation. The phrasing, energy experimentation, was highly irregular for that period, especially within the context of captured Nazi research. Normally, such terminology referred to jet propulsion or chemical fuels, yet Emberlight's attached diagrams suggest something entirely different. Concentric coil assemblies, vacuum chambers, and high-voltage conduits labelled Feuersturmeinheit, firestorm unit. A surviving Peenemünde engineer, Dr. Klaus Reiser, detained during Operation Paperclip and questioned in Fort Hunt, Virginia, gave cryptic testimony. Below the South Block, he said, there was a chamber built for experiments that did not belong to us. It was not propulsion, it was conversion. When pressed to explain, Reiser declined, claiming he had been warned by SS overseers never to mention the chamber of blue light. His interrogator's notes, signed by Major Albert Cronin, conclude, subject exhibits visible distress when referring to substructure 13, mentions project codename Feuersturm repeatedly. In 1951, the U.S. Air Technical Intelligence Service dispatched a covert survey under the cover of geological assessment. The resulting report, unpublished but preserved within the National Archives, contains detailed sketches of a partially collapsed tunnel running northward beneath the Peenemünde complex. At its terminus, a steel door, fused shut, bearing traces of extreme heat. Radiation counters registered low-level readings consistent with uranium decay. Analysts at Fort Detrick later concluded the readings were insufficient to indicate nuclear detonation, but significant enough to suggest contamination event. Meanwhile, in East Germany, Soviet scientific detachments continued excavation of the same region, establishing a restricted zone designated R12 Wall. Local fishermen were prohibited from approaching the northern shoreline, and civilian maps from 1952 onward omitted the area entirely. A Soviet research officer, speaking anonymously in a 1974 BBC interview, stated that the bunker contained devices not of aviation purpose. He described a spherical core encased in graphite with central wiring resembling Tesla configuration. When asked what became of it, he replied, "It was transported east, then all reports ceased." American intelligence remained obsessed with the rumor of a surviving Feuersturm. A 1961 debriefing note from the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence references a non-conventional power unit recovered by Soviet engineers near Peenemünde, possibly of German origin, that produced localized magnetic flux without known fuel source. The memo, stamped Level 4, Restricted Science Access, was declassified in part during the late 1990s. Its final paragraph reads, "Object has been observed emitting thermal output inconsistent with decay curve. Recommends surveillance of Soviet research sectors for anomalous energy signatures." German locals had their own stories. In the 1950s, fishermen near the island of Usedom spoke of nights when the sea glowed from below and compasses spun erratically. Some blamed leftover munitions, others whispered of the old bunker's heart still beating. By 1968, even the East German Stasi grew concerned. Internal correspondence between Ministry of State security officers references civilian hysteria regarding phantom radiation lights and orders the immediate establishment of an exclusion perimeter. The directive, Aktenvermerk 9-148 closed with a chilling instruction: seal the remaining access points. The ground remembers. Years later, after German reunification, Western engineers revisited the Peenemünde ruins for environmental study. Among the debris, they discovered fragments of heavy copper cabling and an engraved steel plate inscribed with the Reichsadler and serial code FS77 Traum, The plate bore traces of indium, a rare metal used in high-voltage rectifiers not manufactured in Germany until the 1950s. That single detail baffled investigators. If accurate, it implied that whatever lay beneath Peenemünde had continued operating long after the war's end, supplied or maintained by an unknown hand. In 1994, a team from the Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics conducted thermal imaging over the site. Against expectation, the scans revealed a faint heat signature beneath the sand, approximately 30 meters below the surface. The shape corresponded to a circular cavity roughly 20 meters wide. The scientists dismissed it as a natural geothermal pocket, yet their internal memo, leaked in 2002, admits that the measured temperature, 48 trangs, was inconsistent with local geological conditions. A handwritten annotation in the margin read simply, "Still active." Today, little remains of Peenemunde's surface installations, but rumors persist among military historians and energy theorists. Some claim the Feuersturm device was an early plasma generator, an experimental attempt at magnetic confinement energy decades before fusion research became public. Others suspect it was weapon-related, a failed prototype for a directed energy system conceived under SS oversight. The lack of surviving documentation fuels both claims. Soviet archives, even after partial declassification, show entire files labeled Peenemünde R12, removed 1958. No one knows where those files went. The most unsettling testimony comes from a 1983 East German security report describing localized electromagnetic anomalies in the vicinity of the old Peenemünde complex. It records multiple instances of radio interference and spontaneous magnetic compass reversals. The final page notes the deployment of a Soviet technical team under Colonel P. Sidorov to neutralize residual activity. What methods they used or what they found remains unknown. The last line of the file, however, survives in translation. Core integrity unstable. Advise permanent containment. No photographs exist of substructure 13. No confirmed survivor ever described entering it. Only scattered accounts, engineers' notes, intercepted transmissions, satellite imagery point toward a buried secret beneath the Baltic sands. Yet even now, during particularly cold winters, local fishermen report a strange fog rising from the shoreline near the old testing range. Instruments falter, batteries die, and when sonar scans the seabed, a single circular echo appears, pulsing faintly, as though something deep below Peenemünde still breathes. Chapter 3, File 72b, the Kessler Memorandum. In late summer 1951, a courier for the fledgling Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND, disappeared somewhere between Bonn and Hamburg. His name was Otto Lenz, a 29-year-old former Wehrmacht signals officer reassigned to domestic intelligence. Witnesses saw him boarding a morning train at Bonn Hauptbahnhof, carrying a briefcase secured by twin combination locks. He never arrived at his destination. The train car he occupied was later found empty, the door unlatched, and a single document floating in the Rhine near Düsseldorf, a carbon copy marked File 72b, Kessler Memorandum. Within hours, the file vanished into the vaults of both Allied and West German intelligence, and the name Kessler entered the quiet lexicon of post-war secrecy. According to what fragments survive, the memorandum was written by Dr. Friedrich Kessler, a former SS psychiatrist attached to Abteilung Tools, the Nazi psychological research division headquartered in Leipzig. The text, cited in later CIA briefings, allegedly detailed methodologies for cognitive manipulation and resistance breakdown. It also outlined an agreement between Western intelligence agencies and select ex-SS researchers to exchange data in return for immunity from prosecution. The memorandum was dated June 27, 1949, 4 years after the war's end, bearing both a Bundesministerium für Verteidigung watermark and an untraceable British government registry stamp. The first public mention of the file surfaced in 1978 during a short-lived West German parliamentary inquiry into Cold War-era human experimentation. One surviving transcript references File 72b as evidence of cooperation between former Axis personnel and Allied psychological divisions. The inquiry was abruptly terminated after British diplomatic intervention, and all related documentation was sealed until 2025. What remains accessible are scattered testimonies, redacted intelligence memos, and a few remaining microfilm copies, smuggled out through Prague in the early 1960s, the Kessler Memorandum described a network of covert facilities across occupied Europe where psychological conditioning was tested on prisoners under the guise of medical research. One such facility, Stalag Neue See, near Bad Sulza, appears repeatedly in the surviving fragments. The memorandum identifies it as a neurological reconfiguration site tasked with inducing extreme compliance through pharmacological stress and sensory deprivation. The goal, Kessler wrote, is to reshape human obedience to surpass ideology, obedience to stimulus, not to cause. Surviving Soviet interrogation records of captured SS scientists confirm that neurological dissociation trials were indeed conducted at Neue See during 1944, using amphetamine derivatives and electrostimulation. After 1945, both Western and Soviet intelligence raced to secure whatever knowledge remained. The American Operation Paperclip program brought several members of Abteilung WWII to the United States, where their expertise was redirected to psychological warfare initiatives. Under the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, declassified 1952 memo from Fort Detrick references a Kessler schema as foundational to the Bluebird and later Artichoke programs, precursors to MKUltra. The Soviets mirrored these efforts within KGB Department 12, focusing on psychotropic modulation through forced association. Both sides denied any knowledge of Kessler himself, though he appeared to have vanished sometime around 1946, last reported crossing from Bavaria into Switzerland under forged Red Cross credentials. In 1962, a suspicious fire broke out in the Wiesbaden Federal Archives, destroying several thousand pages of intelligence material. Among the losses were the complete Abteilung WWII collection and all primary records related to File 72B. Fire brigade reports describe the blaze as originating from a locked basement compartment containing magnetic reels and typed memoranda. Despite heavy damage, investigators found traces of accelerants inconsistent with normal storage chemicals. The official report blamed faulty wiring. Within weeks, both the West German Interior Ministry and the US Office of Policy Coordination ordered the closure of any remaining inquiries. But Prague held a secret. In 1967, Czech defector Captain Ludwig Hesman provided British intelligence with a box of microfilm retrieved from an abandoned Soviet safe house. Among its contents were several frames labeled Kessler 72B. The film was grainy and partially degraded, but analysts identified diagrams resembling electroencephalogram charts, handwritten annotations in both German and English, and repeated references to Protocol 9, memory partition. The document's language suggested ongoing experimentation long after the war, possibly conducted under NATO supervision. The section headings included chilling terms, pattern induction, directive compliance, and identity reset. An internal CIA cable, dated March 14, 1968, confirms awareness of the Prague microfilm. It reads, "Subject Kessler linked to Operation Threshold. Recommend full suppression of media leaks. Deny existence of File 72B." Operation Threshold itself remains largely unknown, but subsequent documents imply a joint US-West German initiative exploring behavioral reprogramming in field conditions. Whether it succeeded or even continued is uncertain, though traces of its methodology appear in later counterintelligence training manuals. By the 1970s, the Kessler Memorandum had become a whisper among intelligence historians, a half-legend dismissed by officials, yet feared by those familiar with post-war ethics breaches. In 1975, investigative journalist Ruth Brandt interviewed a retired NATO medical consultant, Dr. Werner Eckart, who cryptically remarked, "You are chasing ghosts. The Kessler work didn't die. It adapted. It became the language of persuasion, the science behind silence." 2 months later, Brandt's home in Bremen was burglarized, her audio tapes erased and notes confiscated. Police records list unknown intruders, no forced entry. For decades, File 72B resurfaced only in fragments. An index notation from the Bundesarchiv, dated 1988, lists Kessler Memorandum, referred to Foreign Office for evaluation, but no follow-up. In 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a former KGB archivist testified that portions of Kessler's notes were incorporated into a 1955 report on psychoactive conditioning through suggestion, classified under N12 Experimental Research, Moscow Institute. The archivist's statement was dismissed as unverifiable. Recent analysis of declassified NATO correspondence reveals another disturbing thread. In 1953, a joint communiqué between the CIA and the BND, stamped Restricted Psychological Division, lists a Dr. F. Kessler as consultant to the European Defence Initiative on Intelligence Adaptation. His payment records vanish after that year, replaced by coded transactions routed through Zurich banks under the alias Erich Stendal. Some researchers now believe Kessler survived well into the 1960s, possibly working under contract for Western intelligence agencies before being quietly retired, or erased. What makes File 72B so compelling is not only its contents, but its endurance. Each attempt to expose it has been shadowed by suppression, conveniently timed fires, or vanishing witnesses. The few scholars permitted to review related materials under classified access describe its tone as clinical, devoid of remorse. One researcher, speaking anonymously in 2010, described seeing a line that read, "To control a population, first control recall. Memory is loyalty." No one else has confirmed that quote, but it aligns hauntingly with declassified MKUltra doctrine from the same period. In the end, the Kessler Memorandum stands as a ghost document, a whisper linking the atrocities of wartime psychology to the manipulations of the Cold War. No confirmed copy survives, yet its fingerprints appear across decades of covert science, from behavioral experiments to propaganda modeling. Whether Kessler himself was a monster, a visionary, or a myth constructed by bureaucratic paranoia, one truth remains. The world that rose from the ashes of the Reich inherited more than technology and tactics. It inherited methods for reshaping thought itself. Somewhere, buried in microfilm, the words of File 72B still wait, sealed behind classification codes and time, reminding us that the war for the human mind never truly ended. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Wolf's Lair. In the autumn of 1959, 14 years after the collapse of the Third Reich, Polish engineers working near Kętrzyn began clearing the moss-covered ruins of Hitler's former Eastern Front headquarters, the Wolf's Lair or Wolfschanze. What they expected to find were little more than shattered bunkers and rusted steel. What they uncovered instead was a sealed concrete sublevel, its entrance buried beneath layers of rubble and reinforced soil. The discovery began when a demolition worker's drill struck metal nearly 5 meters below the ground. The object turned out to be a hatch, fused shut by welds marked with the Reichsadler and the code RSK4. Local authorities notified the Soviet military administration, which swiftly assumed control of the site and expelled all Polish personnel within hours. The Soviet records that later emerged, declassified in fragments during the 1990s, described the discovery as Incident K59-22. According to an internal memorandum signed by Colonel Alexander Berezhin of the 2nd Directorate, the hatch was pried open by engineers wearing protective suits. Beneath it lay a narrow staircase descending into a corridor lined with corroded lighting fixtures and stagnant water. At the end of the corridor stood a steel door, stamped with the words Reichsärztliche Geheimhaltung, Stufe 4, Medical Secrecy Level 4. Inside, the Soviets reportedly found 6 gurneys, surgical lamps, and an array of broken glass instruments. Several crates were stacked against the wall, marked with red crosses, and the abbreviation RZK. Only one was opened before the Soviets sealed the chamber. It contained a lead-lined cylinder roughly 1 meter long, sealed and labeled simply Project Gertrude. Soviet personnel noted a chemical odor and a faint metallic residue on the cylinder's exterior. Within 24 hours, Moscow ordered the immediate removal of all contents under military escort. According to a logistics manifest retrieved from the Kaliningrad archives, 6 trucks departed the Wolf's Lair on the night of November 3, 1959, escorted by an NKVD detachment under Captain Dmitry Orlov. None of those trucks were ever officially accounted for again. Witness statements collected by Polish workers in nearby Gierwash claim they saw the convoy pass through the forest under heavy fog, the headlights dimmed, soldiers wearing respirators. The following morning, local authorities sealed off the area. When civilians returned weeks later, the hatch had been filled with concrete and the surrounding forest marked off-limits. Decades of speculation followed. Some believed Project Gertrude referred to a late-war bioweapons program. Others argued it was part of the Reich's medical evacuation of confidential research data, possibly linked to Dr. Karl Brandt's human experimentation projects. A letter uncovered in 1965 from the archives of the Soviet Ministry of Health, addressed to Minister Zhdanov, refers to substances of anomalous biological persistence recovered from Hitler's northern compound. Western analysts interpreted this as evidence that the Soviets had found pathogens or radiological material, though no confirmation ever surfaced. In 1974, Polish journalist Marek Gorski published a short article in Życie Warszawy titled The Secret Under Wolfschanze. He cited an unnamed forestry worker who claimed to have seen men in black coats unloading long cases into armoured trucks. Within a week, Gorski's article was pulled from circulation, and the author was detained by the Służba Bezpieczeństwa for anti-state agitation. When released months later, Gorski refused to speak about the event again. His notebook, later found among his possessions after his death in 1982, contained a single cryptic line: "Gertrude sleeps in the ice." By the late 1980s, rumours reached Western intelligence circles. A CIA report labelled WLF 459 summarised intercepted Soviet communications, mentioning Project G. The cable hypothesized the recovery of chemical nerve agents or human biological specimens from the Wolf's Lair site. A marginal note by a Langley analyst reads, Crossref, Reichsärztliche SS-Docs, Ref. Vulcan Trials, 1944. That cross-reference matched a series of documents concerning cold resistance experiments conducted on prisoners in East Prussia during the final months of the war. These tests, aimed at determining survival thresholds in freezing conditions, involved exposure to near-Arctic temperatures and blood infusion with saline and other experimental compounds. The overlap between Vulcan and Gertrude raised chilling implications. In 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, fragments of the Kaliningrad archive were sold on the black market. Among them, a crumpled page from a 1960 NKVD operations log surfaced in Gdansk. It listed the disposition of sealed containers labelled G1 through G6, shipped to Facility P in the Novgorod Oblast. Western analysts later identified Facility P as Object 482 Kol, a known Soviet bioweapons testing site. The same logbook ends with an incomplete entry. G3 compromised. Containment breached. Personnel isolated. No subsequent record exists of Object 482's closure or cleanup. Modern researchers visiting the Wolf's Lair today still report anomalies near the sealed sublevel. Magnetometers show irregular readings. Trees around the site display mutations in bark formation. Soil samples occasionally show trace isotopes of cesium and cobalt, elements consistent with radiological contamination, though at levels too low for conventional warfare materials. Some attribute this to old Soviet munition storage. Others believe remnants of Project Gertrude remain entombed below. One recently surfaced testimony, recorded in 2009 by historian Dr. Anna Kwiatkowska, features an aged Polish engineer named Janusz Poltorak, who claimed to have been among the first to glimpse the sublevel before Soviet arrival. There were 6 tables, he said, and on each one there was a glass tank. Inside, not blood, not water, but something thicker, amber-coloured. I saw shapes inside, like tissue. When the soldiers came, they shouted to leave and pointed guns. They sealed the doors right after. His account, though unverifiable, mirrors elements found in Soviet-era reports describing organic matter preserved in viscous suspension. Further intrigue arose in 2017, when a private geophysical survey commissioned by a Polish Heritage Foundation conducted a deep penetrating radar scan of the Wolf's Lair grounds. The results revealed a subsurface cavity approximately 40 meters long, aligned directly beneath the old Führer bunker. The cavity's internal geometry resembled a corridor with adjoining chambers. When researchers sought permission to excavate, Polish authorities denied the request, citing environmental protection of historical monuments. Nonetheless, leaked correspondence from the Ministry of Culture later mentioned security advisories issued by Russian consular channels regarding interference with Soviet-era burial zones. To this day, the Soviets' official narrative maintains that no such discovery ever occurred. All surviving documentation relating to incident K5922 remains classified. The lead-lined cylinder, the trucks, and the men who transported them vanished without acknowledgement. But hints persist. A 1961 Soviet medical conference cited a presentation titled Long-Term Cellular Suspension Under Controlled Radiation, authored by an unidentified D. Orloff, the same name as the NKVD, captain who escorted the convoy. What lay beneath the wolves? Lair may never be known. Some say it was a failed attempt to weaponize human endurance through cryogenic stasis. Others whisper of grotesque medical specimens preserved as proof of crimes too monstrous to confront. Whether Project Gertrude was a myth, a code for chemical research, or an unholy relic of Nazi science, the evidence suggests that something was taken from those ruins. Something sealed in lead and fear, buried again under new governments and new lies. The forest around Kenshin remains eerily silent, as if guarding the memory of what the earth itself would rather forget. The birds do not sing there at dusk. Locals say the ground hums softly in winter like a heartbeat frozen in stone. Chapter 5. Red Mercury and the Alpine Network. In 1987, workers at a Zurich bank opened a safety deposit box leased under the name Otto Steinmetz, a defunct alias traced to a former SS procurement officer presumed dead in 1945. Inside, investigators found a bundle of decayed papers wrapped in oilcloth, stamped with an eagle insignia and the words, Project Edelstein. The discovery was hushed, its contents transferred to the Swiss Federal Police and then quietly intercepted by NATO's Counter-Proliferation Unit. What those documents contained, according to later leaks, were blueprints and correspondence outlining a smuggling network that had survived the Reich itself, one that linked Nazi-era scientists, Cold War intelligence officers, and modern arms dealers through a single obsession. Red Mercury. The files describe shipments of refined isotope material, hidden among post-war relief supplies and art consignments moving through Austria and northern Italy. Among them was an item coded E9, listed as stabilized red compound with mercury suspension. Chemical notes included phrases such as subcritical plasma stage and non-degrading fissile enhancement. To Western analysts, these were the first hints that Project Edelstein had sought to produce an experimental fusion catalyst, something between myth and science, a compound said to compress nuclear material without detonation. The term red mercury had circulated in clandestine markets since the 1970s, but until that moment, it had always been dismissed as hoax or legend. The Zurich papers changed that. Intelligence agencies scrambled. Within weeks of the discovery, reports of renewed smuggling activity surfaced across the Tyrolean Alps. Old wartime tunnels, once used for SS retreats and gold transports, were being reopened under cover of mining operations. The CIA's Vienna station intercepted coded telexes from Prague and Milan, referring to the stone that burns cold. A joint NATO operation, Stanag 1432, was launched to monitor possible proliferation networks. Its first mission, codenamed Snowfall, involved a small task force tracking couriers between Innsbruck and the Swiss border. On February 12, 1988, one courier was detained carrying a vial sealed in wax, labelled HGP. The contents were confiscated, analysed at the British Atomic Weapons Establishment at Aldermaston, and classified immediately. The official report, later leaked, stated only, "Sample exhibits anomalous isotopic resonance inconsistent with mercury baseline." No further details were released. Behind the official silence, governments waged a quiet war over possession of whatever remained of Project Edelstein. Archival records suggest the project had originated in 1943 under the SS's Entwicklungsstelle Süd, a covert research branch operating from Innsbruck. The group, led by physicist Dr. Theodor Waltz, sought non-conventional detonation agents, capable of collapsing heavy metal isotopes without fissile cores. Most believed the research was theoretical. Others claimed experimental compounds were produced and transported south through the Alps in April 1945, days before Germany's surrender. Waltz himself vanished after the war. However, a letter recovered from the Zurich cache and addressed to T.W. bore a postmark from Buenos Aires, 1953. The trail deepened when, in 1990, declassified Soviet documents revealed that a KGB front company, Technomash Export, had purchased large quantities of specialized vacuum, furnaces and centrifuge parts from West. German suppliers in the 1970s, internal correspondence between Soviet physicists referenced Edelstein derivatives, implying that post-war Nazi research had found a new home behind the Iron Curtain. A CIA memorandum from the same year summarized the situation bluntly. If red mercury exists, both sides have it, and neither side understands it. Then came the anomalies. In 1992, Italian seismographs recorded a localized tremor near the Reschen Pass, a region once riddled with wartime tunnels. Witnesses described a blinding red flash beneath the mountain, followed by days of electrical interference across the surrounding valleys. Austrian military engineers dispatched to investigate found collapsed caverns and melted steel. Yet no trace of explosives or mining equipment. The official explanation cited natural gas ignition. Privately, NATO analysts flagged the coordinates as matching a known Edelstein route. Throughout the 1990s, the legend of red mercury fed the black market. In Sarajevo, Belgrade, and Moscow, vials of crimson gel were sold to arms traffickers for millions. Most were frauds, dyes mixed with mercury oxide, but a handful of intercepted samples defied conventional chemistry. A 1994 UN laboratory report from Vienna classified one specimen as highly dense amalgam, molecular composition inconsistent with known mercury compounds, emits low-level neutron flux. The findings were sealed under diplomatic confidentiality. The container was later transferred to a NATO bunker in Belgium and has never been publicly displayed. By 2003, the surviving fragments of Project Edelstein had been scattered among intelligence archives, private collections, and forgotten vaults. One of the few coherent references appears in a 1975 MI6 briefing, now declassified. Edelstein network persists across Alpine corridor. Former SS intermediaries operating through Swiss industrial fronts. Material believed to have both monetary and theoretical nuclear value. In the margin, an analyst had scribbled a note: "Follow the physicists, not the soldiers." Indeed, the enduring thread connecting every appearance of red mercury is scientific, not ideological. Physicists, chemists, and metallurgists once attached to wartime programs resurfaced in strange places. Argentina, the Soviet Urals, South Africa, always near facilities experimenting with high-energy compounds. What remains most unsettling, however, is the post-Cold War pattern of silence. Several individuals connected to Project Edelstein, or its rediscovery, met abrupt ends. In 1998, Swiss metallurgist Dr. Hans Keller, who had analyzed the Zurich samples, died in a laboratory explosion officially blamed on hydrogen buildup. In 2001, Russian chemist Sergei Andreev disappeared after giving an interview to Izvestia about synthetic heavy element clusters. And in 2014, an Austrian archivist, Franz Leitner, was found dead in his Innsbruck apartment with a coded message written on the wall. "A sleeps beneath the snow." Satellite imagery reviewed in 2015 detected unusual heat signatures along a sealed wartime tunnel network north of Bolzano, Italy, the same region where Nazi gold and artifacts were once rumored to have been stored. Local authorities dismissed it as geothermal fluctuation, but European defense researchers privately labeled it a possible remnant reaction. When NATO requested a survey, Italy refused, citing sovereignty. Subsequent overflights were ordered, discontinued for political stability. The thermal signatures, however, persist. Today, the phrase red mercury remains both myth and classified matter, a term whispered in defense circles but never acknowledged publicly. Some say it was a psychological operation designed to lure rogue states into revealing their nuclear ambitions. Others insist it was real, a condensed plasma catalyst developed by the Reich and smuggled across continents through a network that never died. The Zurich discovery, the Reschen Pass flash, the sealed tunnels, they form a pattern too deliberate for coincidence. Whatever the truth, one fact endures. The war ended, but its science never stopped. Beneath the Alps, in corridors long sealed by stone and secrecy, something once glowed red in the dark. And perhaps, as the newest thermal scans suggest, it still does. Faint, steady, pulsing like the last heartbeat of a weapon that was never meant to exist. For decades, the name Project Edelstein has remained absent from official histories, buried under layers of redacted pages and diplomatic silence. Yet fragments continue to surface. Bank records, coded correspondence, unexplained heat signatures along forgotten Alpine tunnels. Each piece points to a larger truth. that the end of the Second World War did not erase the machinery it created, only drove it underground. If Red Mercury ever existed, it did so in the shadows between science and obsession, between nations willing to kill for secrets older than their own governments. And somewhere beneath the snow, sealed in stone and silence, the pulse of Edelstein may still be beating, waiting for the next war to remember it.